In today's episode, I'm going to tell you about a place that has a pretty pleasant name, but actually packs a pretty hard punch. Today, we're going to be talking about Cherry Point. Welcome to the NC Everything Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, you might see that I'm not in the studio. I made a last-minute decision. My wife made a last-minute decision to head for the beach for the weekend since she had Monday off, and so I'm actually recording down at Myrtle Beach. If you're listening on a podcast player, you might be able to hear the ocean behind me. I don't have a script. This is kind of a quickly thrown together show, but I think it'll be okay. It is freezing out here, but if you know me, the temperature don't stop me from going to the beach. I like the beach any time of year, just like I like the mountains any time of year. Before we get into the content, I do want to say it came to my attention that my past few episodes did not go onto the podcast player. So if you're here looking for the NC Everything Podcast, I'm going to correct that probably next couple days once I get back home. I didn't see that wasn't going up. I just thought it was. Let's see. For all of you new to the show, I usually don't record on location like this. I usually am sitting somewhere around my house. But if you are new here, thank you for joining me. And don't forget to subscribe, like, rate, review. I won't make this the best show I can, but I also haven't had any coffee yet. As far as promotion, if you like the show and you want more NC Everything, don't forget to check out the Facebook group. That sounded weird. And if that still isn't enough, you can check out the YouTube show I do with my wife, Jamie, called Tasting NC, where we taste everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. This is probably going to be a short episode because, like some of my other content, I couldn't find a whole lot on this subject, but I'm going to tell you what I did find out. So let's go ahead and get into Cherry Point. Now, this story actually starts with fish, and it's down on the Neuse River. And it turns out a lot of my shows are somewhere along the Neuse River. It's a great river in North Carolina. But along the Neuse River, there was a hill called Cherry Point. And on this hill, there was a grove of cherry trees. So it wasn't just a cool name. There was actually cherry trees on Cherry Point. Well, in the late 1800s, a bunch of fishermen built a settlement here and called it Cherry Point Landing. And if you don't know, a landing is just a place to launch boats. Well, in 1890, a post office was built in Cherry Point Landing, and the name was shortened to just Cherry Point. And that's pretty much the history of Cherry Point, the settlement. As far as the military base, that story starts with what they call the Sunshine Map. And so the Sunshine Map, they literally look for areas in the country with the most sunshine, the worst weather, and it's all about whether this area is good for flight. Because like most military bases, there will be a lot of planes taking off and landing. And so when they were looking at the Sunshine Map, Cherry Point really stood out. Two things they really didn't like was the fact that the hurricanes usually bust North Carolina up as they move up the coast. And since it was kind of swampy out here, mosquitoes were everywhere. But despite all this, on July 9th, 1941, Congress authorizes the construction of Marine Corps Air Station at Cherry Point. And they gave $14 million to get it done. And that's $14 million in 1941 money. I didn't figure out what that is in modern day money. But after they got the money and they got the permission, they cleared out 8,000 acres of the swamps and farmland. And then on August 18th, 1941, an organization they called Air Facilities Under Development at Cherry Point, North Carolina, was established. And that name is a huge mouthful. But the Air Facilities Under Development at Cherry Point, North Carolina, started draining all the swamps. Then in September of that same year, 1941, the Air Facilities Under Development at Cherry Point, North Carolina, changed Cunningham Field, Cherry Point. And it was named Cunningham Field after the first aviator in the Marine Corps, Lieutenant Colonel Alfred A. Cunningham. 2 months later, in November 1941, they started construction at Cherry Point. And this was just 17 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, after the attack on Pearl Harbor that shook the world, they started really rushing to get the base done. They wrapped it up pretty quick, and in December of 1941, Cunningham Field was changed to U.S. Marine Corps Air Station at Cherry Point, and it was commissioned on May 20th, 1942, which was that following year. And Cherry Point has been a really big factor in pretty much all the wars. In World War II, their mission was to train units and Marines to go fight in the Pacific. They also served as a base for anti-submarine operations on the Atlantic coast. During the Korean War, they trained pilots to head overseas, and during the Vietnam War, they housed the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing and trained A-6 intruder squadrons. And also during Vietnam, or pretty much through all the wars, they trained and retrained a lot of men to keep the steady flow of soldiers heading out to the fronts. During Desert Storm, they provided a lot of aviators and aircraft to the cause. And the same went for all the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan after the attacks on September 11th. And I know I didn't provide a whole lot of information, but that's really all I could find on Cherry Point. I looked and looked and looked, and being a Marine base, they're not going to be advertising everything they do there. And if you ever ride by Cherry Point, it seems like it's in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's 20 miles from the coast, but with all the noise and operations going on there, you don't want it right in the middle of town. And speaking of noise, there is a sign on one of the gates, or maybe all the gates, and it says, "Pardon our noise, it's the sound of freedom," which I thought was funny and kind of cool. And I had read that they do a really good air show down there. I've never actually been to an air show. They have one in Winston-Salem, I think, that I wanted to go to a few years ago, and I missed it. I think Fort Bragg may do one. But they said they put on a hell of a good air show down there at Cherry Point. But today, Cherry Point, it encompasses about 30,000 acres, and it's considered one of the best all-weather jet bases in the world. And the reason is the way their runway is kind of shaped like a cross, so it doesn't matter which way the wind's coming, you can land and take off at Cherry Point. One thing I read that was kind of cool was it said the runways are so long that Cherry Point actually served as an alternate emergency landing site for NASA during the space shuttle program. And one of the last facts I have written down is the current personnel at Cherry Point today is about 53,000 people. And again, I know that was a short episode. It might be best considering the location and the temperature. It's, like I said, it's pretty cold out here. I'm sorry this episode is kind of late. It will come up. Well, when you're getting it, it's probably 2 or 3 days late. Right now, it's only 1 day late. But I'll be getting it up pretty soon. And I'll be working on the actual podcast part of it. So those of you who don't want to watch YouTube can still get the NC Everything podcast. I apologize for that being kind of messed up on that side of it. And again, if you didn't like this episode, check out a few more before you make your decision. And if you did like the episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And as for me, I'm going to go get some coffee, maybe get some breakfast, and warm up a little bit. For you guys, I'll talk to you next time.